Nobody wanted to be the giant cowboy's wife. His towering presence made hearts flutter with fear, not desire. Standing at 7 feet tall, with hands like iron, he cast a shadow that seemed to darken every room he entered, until she arrived in town and saw what everyone else had missed. Beneath that intimidating exterior beat the gentlest heart in all the West. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. In the heart of 1887 Montana, John Brown loomed over Millbrook like a living legend. Standing 7 feet tall, with hands rough as leather, the rancher cast a shadow that stretched across the dusty main street. His voice rumbled like distant thunder, making windows rattle when he spoke, which wasn't often. Most days, he'd ride into town for supplies, nodding silently to those brave enough to meet his gaze. Townsfolk had crafted elaborate tales about the giant. Some swore he'd killed a bear with his bare hands during the harsh winter of '82. Others claimed he'd scared off the notorious Wilson gang just by scowling at them from his porch. Children would dare each other to touch the hitching post outside the general store after he'd tied his horse there, as if his very presence left some magical trace. But no one truly knew the man behind the stories. They didn't see how gently he carved wooden animals by lamplight, how carefully he tended the daffodils growing beside his ranch house, or how his brown eyes reflected a loneliness deeper than the Montana sky. When John posted a simple notice at Mr. Henderson's general store looking for a wife, the entire town erupted in laughter. The paper, written in surprisingly neat handwriting, stated plainly, "Rancher seeks honest woman for marriage. Good land, comfortable home, respectful treatment offered. No flowery promises, just straightforward intent." "Who'd marry that mountain?" chuckled Pete Johnson, slapping his knee. "Might as well wed yourself to a grizzly." Every eligible woman in Millbrook turned away from the notice, some giggling behind gloved hands, others shaking their heads in disbelief. A few even crossed the street when they saw his massive figure approaching, as if his solitude might somehow be contagious. Mary Davis watched this scene unfold from the bakery window across the street. As Mr. Costa's assistant, she spent her days kneading dough and arranging loaves in golden rows, finding quiet purpose in work that fed the very people who barely acknowledged her existence. Orphaned young and with no dowry to speak of, the quiet woman had learned to make herself nearly invisible in the town's social circles. That evening, after the bakery closed, Mary crossed to the general store. Standing alone before the bulletin board, she read John's notice carefully. Something in those simple words stirred her heart, a possibility she hadn't dared imagine in years. Perhaps it was recognition of another soul existing on the margins, or maybe just the honest directness of his request. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Mary felt a flicker of hope. In a town that had no place for either of them, perhaps they might create something together. Mary Davis woke each morning when the stars still hung in the Montana sky. Her small room above Mr. Costa's bakery offered little comfort beyond a narrow bed and a cracked mirror. But it was hers, the only space in Millbrook she could truly claim. By 4 o'clock, she was already downstairs, stoking the massive brick oven until it glowed with fierce heat. The rhythm of baking anchored her days. She kneaded dough with practiced hands, her movements flowing like a silent dance she'd performed 1,000 times before. The bakery filled with golden light as she arranged fresh loaves in neat rows, their crusts crackling as they cooled. Between customers, Mary would often trace her fingers over the worn pages of her mother's recipe book, the only inheritance from a woman whose face grew dimmer in her memory with each passing year. "You have your mother's touch with the bread," Mr. Costa would say, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. The old baker had given her work when no one else would look twice at an orphaned girl with empty pockets and no family connections. That was 7 years ago. When she was barely 17, the townsfolk respected Mary's industry and the quality of her baking, but respect wasn't the same as belonging. The women of Millbrook nodded politely when she delivered their orders, but never invited her to their quilting circles or Sunday socials. She existed on the periphery of their tight-knit world, necessary but not essential, seen but rarely heard. From the bakery window, Mary watched life unfold on Main Street. Young couples strolled arm in arm, their faces bright with possibility. Children chased hoops and played tag, their laughter floating through the open door like music. Families gathered for picnics in the town square, sharing food and stories that would become their shared history. At night, after scrubbing flour from beneath her fingernails and hanging her apron, Mary would sit alone by her window. The solitude pressed against her chest like a physical weight. She'd taught herself to find contentment in small pleasures. The perfect rise of a loaf, the scent of cinnamon, the rare compliment from a customer. Yet beneath her carefully constructed acceptance, a persistent longing remained. "There must be more than this," she whispered to the darkness, her words disappearing into the night. Mary wanted more than to be the woman who baked Millbrook's bread. She wanted a home filled with warmth that wasn't borrowed from an oven. She wanted conversations that lasted beyond the exchange of coins. Most of all, she wanted a life that belonged fully to her, not just the leftover moments between other people's happiness. The October wind carried both wood smoke and the distant echo of laughter as Mary ran her errands through Millbrook. The crisp autumn air had turned the trees along Main Street into bursts of orange and gold, a stark contrast to the gray sky threatening rain. Mary Davis clutched her basket tighter, mentally checking off the items she needed before returning to Mr. Costa's bakery for the afternoon shift. As she approached the general store, she noticed a group of men gathered around the bulletin board, their boisterous laughter cutting through the otherwise peaceful morning. She recognized Frank the blacksmith and several ranch hands from nearby properties, all gesturing toward a notice pinned at the center of the board. "Can you imagine any woman desperate enough?" one called out, slapping his knee. "7 feet of trouble is what he is," another added. "My horse spooks every time that giant walks by." Mary slowed her pace, curiosity overcoming her usual desire to avoid the town's gossip circles. She realized they were discussing John Brown's wife notice. The men continued their cruel jests, each trying to outdo the other with mockery of the giant fool who dared to hope for a wife. "Maybe he should try courting a grizzly instead," Frank suggested, triggering another round of laughter. "At least they match in size." Mary's cheeks burned with unexpected anger. These men knew nothing of loneliness or the courage it took to admit one's desires so plainly. She waited until they dispersed before approaching the bulletin board, pretending to study the various notices while her eyes fixed on John's message. The handwriting surprised her, neat and careful, not the hasty scrawl she might have expected. "Rancher seeks wife. Comfortable home, good land, honest work, no fancy requirements, just companionship and respect. Inquire at Brown Ranch." Such simple words, yet Mary felt something stir within her chest. Beneath the blunt request, she sensed honesty, a longing for peaceful company, not showy romance. No flowery promises or deception, just the straightforward hope of a man who had likely known his share of rejection. She traced the words with her fingertip, remembering how the townsfolk crossed the street when John appeared, how children whispered about the giant who could uproot trees with his bare hands. Yet here was vulnerability pinned for all to see and mock. For the first time in years, Mary wondered if courage wasn't just for men with guns, but for women willing to answer a call that everyone else ignored. She glanced toward the distant hills where the Brown Ranch lay, then back at the notice. With a deep breath, she continued her errands, the seed of a decision taking root in her heart. That night, Mary Davis tossed in her narrow bed, sleep evading her like a skittish animal. The carefully penned words from John's notice kept repeating in her mind. Seeking wife, hard-working, honest woman preferred. comfortable home provided. There was something refreshingly direct about his approach, devoid of pretense or flowery promises. Mary pulled her quilt tighter as memories of her mother surfaced. Choose a man with gentle hands, her mother had once advised while teaching her to knead dough. The strongest men don't need to prove their strength. She wondered what her mother would think of the giant rancher everyone in Millbrook feared. The ache of loneliness she'd buried beneath years of routine work at the bakery rose to the surface. Each morning before dawn, each loaf shaped by her hands, each thank you from customers who never truly saw her. It had been enough to fill her days, but not her heart. Mary stared at the ceiling, imagining a life beyond Mr. Costa's bakery. Not a life of luxury, but one where she might be a partner rather than just a worker, where her thoughts and feelings mattered to someone. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through her curtains, Mary had made her decision. She rose quickly, washing her face in the basin and pinning her hair neatly. From her small trunk, she retrieved her most precious possession, her mother's recipe book. Pages yellowed and edges worn from years of use. She added a clean dress, a shawl, and her Sunday shoes, wrapping everything in a bundle. The bakery was quiet when she entered. Mr. Costa wouldn't arrive for another hour. Mary penned a brief note explaining she would be absent for the day, placing it where the kindly baker would find it. She felt a pang of guilt. The old man had been good to her, offering steady employment when no one else would. After taking a small loaf of yesterday's bread and a wedge of cheese, Mary headed to the livery stable. She arranged to borrow a gentle mare, explaining she needed to visit a friend outside town. The stable boy looked curious, but asked no questions as he helped her mount. As the horse carried her toward Brown Ranch, Mary's heart hammered against her ribs. What was she doing? Respectable women didn't call on men uninvited, yet the alternative, continuing her lonely existence, watching life pass by, suddenly seemed more frightening than facing the giant cowboy. With each hoofbeat, hope and fear battled within her. The morning sun warmed her back as Millbrook fell away behind her. Whatever awaited at the ranch, Mary had already taken the hardest step, choosing to seek something more than mere survival. The ranch appeared over a golden ridge, larger and brighter than Mary had pictured. A white house with green shutters, a sturdy barn, and fences so straight they seemed drawn by a ruler. The morning light bathed everything in amber, making the modest homestead look almost magical against the Montana landscape. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, while the autumn grass bent like waves of fire under the gentle breeze. Mary Davis pulled her shawl tighter as she guided her borrowed horse along the final stretch of dirt road. Her heart pounded against her ribs with each step closer to John Brown's property. She had heard so many stories about the giant rancher, tales of his fearsome strength, his intimidating presence, his isolation from town life. Yet something in his written words had called to her, revealing a loneliness that matched her own. As she approached, she noticed details that contradicted the fearsome image Millbrook's gossips had painted. Flower beds bordered the path to the house. Their blooms faded, but still tended. The porch had been swept clean. Smoke curled invitingly from the chimney. These weren't the marks of a wild man or a brute, but of someone who cared for his home. Mary dismounted carefully, her legs trembling both from the unaccustomed ride and from the enormity of what she was doing. No respectable woman in Millbrook would have dared come alone to a bachelor's ranch, especially one owned by a man the town collectively feared. Yet here she stood, 26 years old, with nothing but her reputation and her mother's recipe book clutched to her chest like a shield. She tied her horse to the hitching post and took a deep breath. The weight of her decision pressed down on her shoulders. What if the townspeople were right? What if John was as dangerous as they claimed? But then she remembered the careful handwriting on his notice, the simple honesty of his request, and the years of loneliness stretching behind and before her at the bakery. "I've come too far to turn back now," she whispered to herself, squaring her shoulders. Mary smoothed her simple blue dress, the best she owned, and touched her hair, making sure it was still neatly pinned. With each step toward the porch, she felt both terrified and strangely liberated. Whatever happened next would be her choice, her risk, her chance at something more than the half-life she'd been living. She raised her hand to knock, determined to meet the man behind the legend, no matter what she found on the other side of the door. The door creaked open, and John Brown filled the entire frame, his broad shoulders nearly touching both sides, his dark hair as black as midnight falling just past his collar. His beard was trimmed with surprising care, revealing a strong jawline that contradicted the wild tales circulating through Millbrook. But what struck Mary most were his eyes, deep brown and gentle, cautious, like those of a man who'd spent a lifetime being misunderstood. "Miss Davis?" he rumbled, his voice deep but softer than she'd imagined. Genuine surprise registered on his face as he recognized the baker's assistant standing on his porch. "You came about the notice?" Mary felt her heart flutter but steadied herself. She'd come too far to turn back now. "I did," she answered, her voice unwavering despite her nerves. "I wanted to meet the man who asked so honestly for what he wanted." She clutched her small handbag tighter, feeling the weight of her decision with each passing second. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken questions and hesitations, yet not unkind. John shifted his weight, his massive frame somehow managing to appear uncertain. The rancher studied her face as if searching for mockery or fear, but found only sincerity. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" he finally asked, stepping aside with a careful movement that seemed practiced, the motion of a man constantly aware of his intimidating size. "It's fresh brewed." Mary nodded and stepped past him into the house, catching the scent of coffee mingled with wood smoke and leather. Their shoulders didn't touch as she passed, yet she felt the warmth radiating from him in the cool autumn air. Inside, she noticed how he ducked slightly through doorways out of habit, though the ranch house had been built with higher ceilings than most. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he led her toward the kitchen, each step measured and deliberate. "I don't get many visitors," John explained, his deep voice resonating in the quiet house. He gestured toward a chair at a solid wooden table, the specially not from town. "People fear what they don't understand," Mary replied, settling into the offered seat. She watched as his large hands that could easily break a man, according to town gossip, delicately handled two porcelain cups with surprising grace. Neither spoke as he poured the coffee, both uncertain of what came next, yet unwilling to let this fragile moment slip away. They were two lonely souls perched on the edge of possibility, each wondering if the other might be the answer to years of silent prayers. Inside the ranch house, Mary Davis found herself surrounded by unexpected warmth. The space was meticulously organized, with sturdy furniture built for a man of John Brown's stature. Bookshelves lined one wall, novels, farming manuals, and leather-bound journals, suggesting a mind far more curious than the townsfolk of Millbrook ever acknowledged. On the mantel above a stone fireplace, a collection of hand-carved wooden animals stood in silent testimony to hours spent in solitude. Mary accepted the steaming cup of coffee John offered, noticing how carefully he moved despite his enormous hands. As she sipped the rich brew, her eyes were drawn to a particularly exquisite carving of a horse, its mane flowing as if caught in mid-gallop, every muscle defined with remarkable precision. "Did you make these?" she asked, gesturing toward the collection. John nodded, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. "My father taught me. Said a man needs something to do with his hands when winter comes and the days grow short." The giant rancher settled into a chair that creaked beneath his weight. Though shy, his words began to flow with surprising eloquence as he spoke of his father's legacy: the land, the livestock, the values of hard work and honesty. His deep voice softened when he mentioned his mother, describing how the house had fallen silent after her passing 5 years earlier. "The ranch kept growing," John explained, gesturing toward the window where his cattle grazed on rolling pastures. But the quiet, it presses in sometimes. A man can talk to his horses, but they don't talk back. Mary found herself nodding, understanding the particular ache of solitude he described. She shared her own story, being orphaned at 14, finding work at Mr. Costa's bakery, learning to survive on the margins of a community that respected her work but never truly welcomed her into its heart. "I know what it's like," she admitted, "to be surrounded by people, yet still feel alone." The afternoon light shifted through the windows as they talked, casting golden patterns across the wooden floor. John showed her his father's old Bible, the pressed wildflower his mother had kept from their wedding day, the first tiny horse he'd carved as a boy. Each object held a story. Each story revealed another layer of the gentle soul hidden behind his intimidating frame. Mary realized with startling clarity that they were both survivors of a particular kind of loneliness, not the fleeting solitude that comes and goes, but the deep isolation of being perpetually misunderstood. As strangers revealing their wounds to each other, they discovered something neither had dared hope for: the possibility of being truly seen. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor as Mary Davis and John Brown sat at his kitchen table. Hours had passed in conversation, yet neither had noticed the sun's journey across the sky. Their cups of coffee had gone cold, forgotten as they shared stories of their lives. Mary found herself captivated by John's unexpected humor. His deep laugh rumbled like distant thunder, gentle and warm. When he spoke of his cattle and the challenges of last winter's blizzard, his eyes lit up with a passion that transformed his entire countenance. "The smallest calf was near frozen," John explained, his massive hands moving delicately as he described how he'd brought the animal into his own kitchen. "Wrapped her in blankets right by this stove. Mrs. Peterson, from the next ranch, thought I'd lost my mind." What struck Mary most was how the giant moved through his home. Each step measured, each reach for a cup or gesture during a story executed with deliberate care. He shifted his chair slowly when he stood, as if constantly aware of how his size might startle others. She realized he'd spent a lifetime learning to make himself less frightening, less imposing. "People expect me to break things," he admitted quietly when she commented on his grace. "So I learned not to." The confession touched something deep within her. Mary understood what it meant to move through the world trying not to disturb others, to make yourself smaller than you were. As the light faded to purple dusk, Mary reluctantly rose to leave. "I should return to town before dark," she said, smoothing her skirt. "Mr. Costa will need help with tomorrow's baking." John stood, towering above her, yet somehow making himself seem less imposing. He cleared his throat, his fingers working nervously at his side. "Miss Davis," he began, then corrected himself. "Mary, I wonder if you'd consider returning this weekend. I could show you the rest of the ranch, the horses, perhaps. The view from the North Ridge is quite something." The baker's assistant felt warmth spread through her chest at his invitation. His eyes held hope and vulnerability that matched her own. "I'd like that very much, John," she replied, her smile genuine. On the ride back to Millbrook, Mary found herself planning what she might bake to bring on her next visit. The usual weariness that accompanied her evening journeys was absent, replaced by a lightness she hadn't felt in years. For once, the path ahead seemed filled with possibility rather than mere obligation. The morning sun bathed Millbrook in golden light as Mary Davis set out for Brown Ranch, a wicker basket swinging from her arm. Inside lay fresh sourdough bread and a small crock of honey butter she'd churned before dawn. The familiar weight of anticipation settled in her chest as the ranch appeared on the horizon. John Brown stood waiting on the porch, his massive frame somehow softened by his efforts to appear presentable. He pressed his best shirt until the wrinkles surrendered, polished his boots to a mirror shine, and trimmed his beard with careful precision. When he spotted Mary approaching, his face transformed with a smile that was equal parts hope and awkwardness. "You came back," he said, his deep voice carrying across the yard. Mary nodded, suddenly shy. "I brought something for lunch," she offered, lifting the basket. The giant rancher stepped forward to take it, his movements deliberately gentle. "It smells wonderful," he murmured, leading her inside where he'd prepared the table with a clean cloth and wildflowers in a mason jar. These small courtesies, a trimmed beard, a tidy home, flowers gathered from the fields, spoke volumes about his character. Mary noticed how he'd swept the floors and dusted the bookshelves, how he'd arranged his carved wooden animals in neat rows along the mantel. After a light meal, John offered to show Mary around the property. "I'd like you to see what I've built here," he said, his brown eyes earnest. The tour began with the sturdy barns, their beams hand-hewn and solid. Fat cattle grazed in fenced pastures, their coats gleaming with health. John explained his breeding program with quiet pride, pointing out bloodlines and potential. "The vegetables are over here," he said, leading her to a garden that surprised Mary with its thoughtful design. Rows of corn, beans, and squash stood in perfect alignment, bordered by stone pathways that John had laid himself. "You've created something beautiful," Mary said, genuinely impressed by the blend of practicality and aesthetics. A flush crept up the rancher's neck. "There's one more thing," he mumbled, guiding her around the corner of the house. There, sheltered from harsh winds, bloomed a garden of daffodils and tulips, bright splashes of color against the rugged Montana landscape. John knelt beside them, his massive hands suddenly delicate as he touched a yellow petal. "My mother planted the first bulbs," he explained. "After she passed, I kept them going, added more each year." Mary watched him tend the flowers, this giant of a man who towered over everyone in Millbrook, yet moved with such tenderness among fragile blooms. In that moment, she glimpsed the heart beneath the intimidating exterior, a heart that someone who won't be frightened when I don't speak for hours because I'm thinking, or when I move too suddenly. Mary watched his profile against the sunset, seeing vulnerability beneath his strength. "Most people in town only see your size," she observed. "They never bothered to look further." "And you?" he asked, turning those gentle brown eyes toward her. "I see a man who carves beauty from wood, who plants flowers for his mother, who moves carefully so as not to frighten others." Mary's heart opened like a flower to morning sun. "I'm not afraid of your silence, John. Sometimes words just get in the way of understanding." They talked until the sky turned purple, then indigo. John spoke of his father teaching him to respect the land, of lonely winters when blizzards kept him isolated for weeks. Mary shared memories of her mother's hands, guiding hers through bread dough, of the small kindnesses Mr. Costa had shown her when no one else would hire an orphaned girl. Laughter came easier with each hour, their dreams unfolding between them. His hopes for breeding horses with the perfect temperament, her desire to create a home filled with warmth and purpose. The conversation flowed naturally, as if they'd known each other for years, instead of days. When Mary finally rose to leave, John led her around the side of the house. There, hanging from the sturdy branch of an old oak tree, was a porch swing he'd crafted himself, wide enough for two, with intricate carvings along the back depicting wildflowers and horses. "I built it yesterday," he admitted, a flush creeping up his neck. "Hoping you might want to come back." Mary ran her fingers over the polished wood, feeling the care in every detail. Tears gathered in her eyes at the simple gesture. This wasn't just furniture. It was hope given physical form, a promise carved by patient hands. No man had ever created something so beautiful with her in mind. "I'll be back," she whispered, the words a promise of her own. Mary Davis arrived at the Brown Ranch as the first snowflakes of winter drifted lazily from the steel-gray Montana sky. The journey from Millbrook had been cold, but the sight of smoke curling from the chimney warmed her heart more than any fire could. As she approached the house, John Brown emerged from the barn, his massive frame moving with that careful grace she'd come to admire. "You made it before the storm," he said, taking her horse's reins with gentle hands. His deep voice carried relief, as if he'd been watching the horizon all morning. Inside, the ranch house had transformed since her first visit. A pot of stew simmered on the hearth, filling the air with the rich aroma of beef and herbs. But what caught Mary's eye was the kitchen pantry, now stocked with flour, sugar, cinnamon, and vanilla. John had even acquired a set of baking pans, arranged neatly on a new shelf. "I thought you might want to bake," he explained, his cheeks coloring slightly above his beard. "The supplies came from Helena last week." Mary ran her fingers over the flour sack, touched by the thoughtfulness behind this simple gesture. "This is perfect," she whispered, already imagining the comfort of kneading dough in this kitchen, his kitchen, that somehow already felt partly hers. They spent the afternoon working side by side, Mary teaching John how to properly knead bread dough while he showed her how to tend the fire for even heat. Their movements synchronized naturally, passing utensils and ingredients without words, stepping around each other in the small kitchen with an ease that felt like they'd been doing this for years. As the bread baked, they sat at the table with steaming mugs of coffee. The rancher's eyes lit up as he spoke of his plans, expanding the cattle herd come spring, starting a horse breeding program with 2 fine mares he'd had his eye on. "I've been saving for years," John explained, his large hands cupped around the mug. "The land can support twice what I'm running now, and the horses, there's good money in quality stock." He paused, looking directly at Mary. "It's a lot of work for one person, always has been. But with a partner, ... His voice trailed off, but his meaning was clear. Mary felt something settle inside her chest, a certainty she hadn't expected. As snow gathered on the windowsills and the scent of fresh bread filled the warm kitchen, she realized she wanted this life. Not just any life away from the bakery, but this specific one. Mornings with this gentle giant, evenings by this hearth, years building something meaningful together. "I'd like to see those mares," she said softly, her hand finding his across the table. "And perhaps we could plant more vegetables come spring." The autumn night had settled over the ranch, bringing with it a crisp chill that painted their breaths in soft clouds. John Brown and Mary Davis sat huddled together on the porch swing he had crafted with his own hands, wool blankets wrapped around their shoulders, as they gently rocked back and forth. The distant howl of a coyote and the occasional creak of the swing were the only sounds breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Mary," John finally said, his deep voice softer than usual, "I've been meaning to speak with you about something important." His large hands, calloused from years of ranch work, fidgeted slightly with the edge of the blanket. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the warm glow from the lantern hanging nearby. "What is it, John?" The giant rancher took a deep breath, his broad shoulders rising and falling beneath the blanket. "I want to propose to you," he stated plainly, without preamble or flowery words. "But before I do, you should know what you'd be agreeing to." Mary listened intently as John described the reality of ranch life. The isolation during harsh Montana winters, the endless work from dawn until dusk, the distance from town and its comforts. He spoke of his own shortcomings too, how his towering presence made people uncomfortable, how he struggled with words and social gatherings. "I'm not a man who can offer fancy parties or trips to Helena," he continued, his brown eyes earnest in the dim light. "But I can promise honest work, a warm home, and a husband who would cherish you every day." The baker's assistant reached out, her smaller hand covering his. "John," she began, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, "I've never wanted those things. What I want is exactly what you're offering, a life built on truth and partnership." She told him how she dreamed of waking to purpose each day, of building something lasting with someone who saw her completely. "I want quiet evenings like this one," she whispered, "and the freedom to create a life that belongs to us alone." The vulnerability hanging between them was almost tangible, a bridge connecting two souls who had known too much loneliness. John gently squeezed her hand, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Then will you marry me, Mary Davis?" he asked, his voice barely audible above the night sounds of the ranch. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "With all my heart, yes." For the first time in her life, Mary felt the future opening before her, not as something to endure, but as something to create. This choice, freely made beside the man whose gentle heart matched his giant frame, felt like the first true decision of her life. The autumn sunlight streamed through the windows of the ranch house as Mary Davis laid out her simple wedding dress on the bed. It wasn't fancy, just a cream-colored cotton gown with lace trim she'd sewn herself, but it represented everything she'd never dared to hope for, a future built on choice rather than circumstance. Outside, John Brown was repairing fence posts, his massive frame silhouetted against the Montana sky. Mary smiled at the sight of him, still amazed that this gentle giant had chosen her, had seen beyond her plain features to the woman beneath. The knock at the door came without warning, 3 sharp raps that echoed through the quiet house. When Mary opened it, she found herself facing a stranger, a well-dressed man with a thin mustache and cold eyes that sparked a distant memory. "Mary," he said, removing his hat with practiced elegance. "It's been quite some time." Her blood ran cold as recognition dawned. "Thomas Miller." The man smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Your husband, my dear. I've come to collect what's mine." Mary's hands trembled as Thomas produced documents from his leather satchel, papers with her signature, dating back 7 years when she'd been desperate for work after her mother's death. She remembered signing something at his father's estate, but never a marriage certificate. "This isn't real," she whispered, but the official stamps and seals mocked her certainty. "The law disagrees," Thomas replied smoothly. "I've been searching for you since you fled. My father has passed, leaving considerable assets that require my attention, and a legitimate wife by my side." John appeared in the doorway then, ducking his head to enter. The rancher's presence filled the room, but Thomas didn't flinch. "What's happening?" John asked, his deep voice gentle despite the concern etched on his face. Before Mary could explain, Thomas stepped forward. "I'm reclaiming my wife. These documents are legally binding. Harbor her, and you'll face charges of abetting a runaway wife." Mary watched as John's expression shifted from confusion to protective anger. She placed a hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "I never knowingly married him," she explained, tears threatening. "I signed papers for employment, nothing more." Thomas laughed coldly. "A convenient story. The courts will side with documentation over the word of a penniless woman." The world Mary had carefully built with John, the porch swing, the garden plans, their shared dreams of children and horses, seemed to crumble beneath her feet. The baker's assistant, who had finally found courage, now faced an impossible choice: stay and bring legal trouble to the man she loved, or leave with a manipulator who had stolen her freedom through deceit. "You have until tomorrow," Thomas announced, placing his hat back on his head. "After that, I return with the sheriff." The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Mary Davis and John Brown stood frozen in disbelief, the fraudulent marriage documents trembling in Mary's hands. Their fingers intertwined, desperate for an anchor in the storm that had suddenly engulfed them. "He'll have you arrested for kidnapping," Mary whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't let that happen to you, John." The giant rancher's shoulders slumped as he processed their impossible situation. His brown eyes, usually so gentle, darkened with a pain that made Mary's heart constrict. "There must be another way," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Mary placed her palm against his rough cheek. "I'll go with him, just for now. It'll buy us time to fight this properly." When Thomas Miller arrived with the sheriff from the next county, Mary had already packed a small bag. She slipped her mother's recipe book inside, a talisman of hope she refused to abandon. John watched helplessly as Thomas gripped Mary's arm, his well-manicured fingers digging into her flesh. "I'll come back to you," she mouthed silently, as Thomas led her to the waiting carriage. John stood motionless until the dust from their departure settled on the empty road. Then something shifted in him, grief crystallizing into determination. He wouldn't lose Mary to a fraud and a piece of paper. By nightfall, John was riding hard toward Pete Johnson's ranch. The older rancher listened gravely as John explained their predicament, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Thomas Miller, you say?" Pete stroked his gray beard. "Name sounds familiar. Might have pulled similar schemes in Wyoming territory." Hope flickered in John's chest. "Can you help me?" "Samuel Morrison in Helena," Pete replied without hesitation. "Best attorney in Montana. Owes me a favor from the cattle wars. We'll send a telegram first thing tomorrow." John nodded, his massive hands clenching and unclenching. "And while we wait for the law?" Pete's eyes met his. "We track them. Miller will head east, trying to cross state lines before anyone catches wind of his game." Before dawn, John had dispatched a ranch hand with an urgent telegram to Helena. The message was simple. "Fraudulent marriage claim. Woman taken against will. Require immediate assistance. Pete Johnson vouches." As the first light broke over the mountains, John mounted his strongest horse. In his saddlebag, he carried the carved wooden horse Mary had admired, a promise that their story wasn't finished. "I'll find you," he whispered to the wind, hoping somehow she would hear him. "Whatever it takes, I'm coming for you, Mary." With Pete Johnson riding beside him, John Brown turned his horse eastward, following the trail of the woman who had dared to see beyond his fearsome reputation to the gentle heart beneath. The carriage rattled over the rough Montana terrain, each bump and jolt a reminder to Mary Davis of her desperate situation. Thomas Miller kept a firm grip on her arm, his well-manicured fingers digging into her flesh as he attempted to spirit her across the state line. His plan was simple: get far enough away that John's influence couldn't reach them, then enforce his fraudulent marriage claim where no one knew their history. "You're wasting your time," Mary said, her voice steady despite her fear. "John will find us." Thomas laughed, the sound hollow in the confined space. "Your giant won't even know which direction we've gone." But Mary was smarter than he realized. While pretending to adjust her wedding dress, the one she'd sewn with such hope for her ceremony with John, she carefully tore small strips from the hem, dropping them whenever Thomas looked away. Each scrap of white fabric marked their trail through the wilderness like breadcrumbs. Meanwhile, John Brown rode like a man possessed. The rancher had gathered supplies in minutes, his large hands moving with surprising efficiency. Pete Johnson had provided him with maps showing every shortcut through the territory, paths only locals knew existed. John's horse, sensing its rider's urgency, pushed forward tirelessly. "I'm coming, Mary," he whispered into the wind, his deep voice barely audible over the thundering hooves. By nightfall, Thomas had grown increasingly paranoid. He forced Mary from the carriage at a remote cabin, binding her hands with rope while he consulted his maps. "We'll rest here tonight," he announced, confidence wavering as he peered into the darkness. Mary tested her bonds discreetly. The knots were tight, but she kept working at them, determined to create any advantage she could. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "Patience outlasts panic." So she waited, watching Thomas grow more anxious with each passing hour. Just before midnight, a floorboard creaked outside. Thomas jumped to his feet, pistol drawn. The door burst open with such force it nearly flew from its hinges. John filled the doorframe, his massive silhouette illuminated by moonlight. "Let her go," he demanded, his voice like distant thunder. What followed happened so quickly, Mary barely had time to process it. Thomas fired wildly, the bullets splintering wood beside John's head. The giant cowboy moved with surprising speed, disarming Thomas with one powerful sweep of his arm. The con man crumpled under a single blow from John's fist. "Are you hurt?" John asked, his gentle eyes scanning Mary for injuries as he untied her bonds. Exhausted but together, they dismounted from their horses, clinging to each other as if afraid one might disappear. Their momentary relief was short-lived, however, as the sound of approaching hoofbeats sent them both rigid with tension. Sheriff Williams rode up the path, his weathered face unreadable. Behind him followed a distinguished gentleman in a tailored suit whom Mary didn't recognize. Her heart sank, expecting more trouble, but John stepped protectively in front of her, his massive frame a shield against whatever came next. "John Brown," the sheriff called out, "this here is Samuel Morrison from Helena. He's been looking for your Mary, or rather, for the man chasing her." The attorney dismounted with practiced ease, extending his hand to John. "Mr. Brown, I've been tracking Thomas Miller's activities across 3 territories. He's made quite a career of tricking vulnerable women into fraudulent marriages to access their assets or inheritance." Mary gasped, her fingers digging into John's arm. "There are others?" Morrison nodded grimly. "6 that we know of. I've brought affidavits from his former household staff and 3 previous victims." He patted his leather satchel. "Enough evidence to challenge any claim he has on you in court." Relief washed over Mary's face, but John remained tense, scanning the horizon. He won't give up easily. He's desperate and dangerous. As if summoned by his words, a cloud of dust appeared on the road. Thomas Miller approached with 4 rough-looking men, their expressions hard as they surrounded the ranch house. "Mary belongs to me legally," Thomas shouted, his refined facade cracking under pressure. "Step aside or face the consequences." Sheriff Williams moved forward, hand resting on his pistol. "The law stands with Mrs. Davis today, Miller. Your documents won't hold up against what Morrison's brought to light." To everyone's surprise, Mr. Costa's wagon appeared behind Thomas's group. The elderly baker climbed down, his kind face set with determination. "I've known Mary since she was just a girl. She worked honest and hard for me for years. This man is no husband to her." Thomas's hired men shifted uncomfortably, looking to their employer for direction, as they found themselves facing not just a giant rancher, but the law itself. The sheriff unfolded one of Morrison's documents. "Thomas Miller, you're wanted for fraud in Wyoming territory. These men can either ride away now or join you in custody." Mary watched as Thomas's power crumbled before her eyes. The wall of support surrounding her, John's unwavering presence, Morrison's legal expertise, the sheriff's authority, and even Mr. Costa's simple testimony, stripped away the chains that had bound her for so long. The courtroom fell silent as Samuel Morrison presented the final piece of evidence, a stack of affidavits from 5 other women across 3 states. Thomas Miller's face drained of color as the attorney methodically dismantled his fraudulent empire. The judge, a stern man with 40 years on the bench, needed only minutes to render his decision. "Mr. Miller, I find sufficient evidence to nullify any claim of marriage to Mary Davis. Furthermore, I am forwarding these documents to federal authorities for criminal prosecution." The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the room like a gunshot. Thomas Miller, once so confident in his schemes, now stood diminished. His expensive suit couldn't hide the desperation in his eyes as 2 deputies approached. "This isn't over," he hissed at Mary, but his threats rang hollow. The con man who had terrorized her future was being led away in handcuffs, his power evaporating with each step. Mary felt John's large hand envelop hers, his touch gentle despite his strength. For the first time since she could remember, she breathed freely, without the shadow of fear or obligation. "It's really over," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Outside the courthouse, Mr. Costa waited with a basket of fresh bread, a small celebration of freedom. The baker embraced Mary with fatherly affection. "I always knew you were meant for better things," he said, his weathered face creased with pride. Word spread through Millbrook like wildfire. By evening, the story had transformed from scandalous gossip to something resembling a folk tale. How the giant rancher and the baker's assistant had faced down a villain together. The same women who had once crossed the street to avoid John now stopped Mary in the general store, offering congratulations and invitations to socially gatherings. "Mrs. Holloway has invited us to Sunday dinner," Mary told John that evening as they sat on their porch swing. "And the quilting circle wants me to join them." He smiled, the expression transforming his face. "The town's finally seeing what I saw in you from the beginning." Even Sheriff Williams, who had once regarded John with suspicion, tipped his hat respectfully when they passed on Main Street. "Fine work standing by your woman," he acknowledged. "Takes real courage, not just size." As they rode back to the ranch that evening, the setting sun painted Montana's vast sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Mary looked at the man beside her, this gentle giant who had risked everything to fight for her freedom, and felt a profound sense of belonging. "We're home now," John said simply, his deep voice carrying across the golden fields. "Truly home," Mary nodded, knowing he meant more than just the ranch waiting beyond the ridge. They had found home in each other, and now, at last, in the community that had finally opened its heart to them both. Under a canopy of Montana's spring wildflowers, Mary Davis and John Brown joined hands before a small gathering of genuine friends. The ceremony took place on the sprawling porch of the Brown Ranch, where Pete Johnson stood proudly as John's best man and Mr. Costa beamed like a father giving away his daughter. The giant cowboy, dressed in his finest clothes with his beard neatly trimmed, looked down at his bride with eyes that reflected all the tenderness his massive frame concealed from strangers. Mary wore a simple white dress adorned with lace she had carefully saved for years. In her hands, she carried wildflowers gathered that morning from the meadow, where they had first begun to hope for a future together. The ceremony itself was brief, but heartfelt. No elaborate vows were needed between two people who had already proven their devotion through trials that would have broken lesser spirits. "I never thought I'd find someone who saw past what everyone feared," John whispered as he slipped the ring onto her finger, his deep voice carrying just far enough for their closest friends to hear. "And I never imagined finding a home where I truly belonged," Mary replied, her voice steady, despite the tears glistening in her eyes. After the ceremony, they celebrated with a feast spread across tables in the yard. The baker had insisted on providing the wedding cake, his contribution to the happiness of the young woman who had worked faithfully at his side for so many years. Samuel Morrison made the journey from Helena, raising a toast to justice and love, the two forces that truly civilized the West. As summer turned to fall, the newlyweds poured their combined energy into expanding the ranch. John's gentle way with horses became the foundation of their breeding program, while Mary's organizational skills transformed the business side of their operation. Together, they built additional rooms onto the house, planning for the family they hoped to create. Each evening, regardless of how exhausting the day had been, they made time to sit together on the porch swing John had built during their courtship. Sometimes they spoke of their plans for the future. Other times, they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "I used to fear silence," Mary confessed one evening, her head resting against her husband's shoulder. "Now I find it's where our strength lives." John nodded, his large hand enveloping hers. "We've weathered enough storms to appreciate the calm," he replied, gazing out at the land that had once been his lonely kingdom and was now their shared haven. The passage of time had been kind to the Brown Ranch. 10 years had transformed not just the land, but the lives that flourished upon it. Their son, Thomas, named for John's grandfather rather than the man who had nearly torn them apart, had just celebrated his 8th birthday. The boy had inherited his father's height and his mother's gentle determination, a perfect blend of the two people who adored him beyond measure. John Brown spent evenings teaching Thomas the art of woodcarving, their heads bent together over blocks of pine and cedar. The giant's hands, once feared throughout Millbrook, now guided his son's smaller ones with infinite patience. "Steady now," he would murmur, his deep voice soft as he showed Thomas how to follow the grain of the wood. "Just like my father taught me, and his father before him." Mary watched them from the doorway, her heart full. The kitchen behind her was warm with the scent of fresh bread, a daily ritual she had carried from her days at the bakery. Though Mr. Costa had long since retired, he still visited monthly for dinner, delighting in Mary's improvements to her mother's recipes. The ranch had grown famous throughout Montana Territory. Ranchers traveled from as far as Helena to purchase the Browns' horses, known for their strength, intelligence, and gentle temperament. Like their owner, folks would say with a nod toward John, no longer whispering behind his back, but speaking with genuine respect. Mary herself had found an unexpected place in the community. Women who had once crossed the street to avoid her now sought her advice on everything from baking to child-rearing. The quiet baker's assistant had become a confidant to many, her steady resilience an inspiration. On warm evenings, neighbors would gather on the expanded porch, sharing stories and laughter. Pete Johnson, now gray-haired but still sharp-witted, remained their closest friend, bringing news from town and playing checkers with Thomas. Even Samuel Morrison visited yearly, bringing law books for the boy who showed an early interest in justice. What surprised Mary most was how John still looked at her, with wonder and gratitude, as though she were the miracle rather than the life they'd built together. When they sat on the porch swing after Thomas was asleep, his arm around her shoulders, she would sometimes catch him watching her with the same awe he'd shown on that first day she'd appeared on his doorstep. "What are you thinking?" she asked one evening as twilight painted the mountains purple. "That I'm the luckiest man in Montana," he replied, his voice rumbling through the quiet. "Maybe in all the world." Mary leaned against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "We both are," she whispered, knowing that the journey, however difficult, had led them exactly where they belonged. One spring afternoon, Mary Brown sat on the porch swing, watching her husband and son through the open doorway. John and little Thomas hunched over the workbench by the window, sunlight streaming across their matching dark hair as they carved a wooden horse together. John's massive hands guided their 5-year-old son's smaller ones with remarkable gentleness, showing the boy how to follow the grain of the wood just as John's father had taught him decades ago. "Not too hard now," John's deep voice rumbled softly. "Let the wood tell you what it wants to be." Mary rested her hand on her swollen belly, feeling their second child kick beneath her apron. The ranch had flourished beyond their wildest dreams in these 7 years of marriage. What had once been a lonely homestead now bustled with activity, ranch hands tending to the prized horses that buyers came from as far as Helena to purchase, vegetable gardens twice the size of her first attempts, and the new east wing they'd added to accommodate their growing family. She thought back to that bulletin board notice that had changed everything. How terrified she'd been riding out here that first day, expecting to meet the fearsome giant of Millbrook's rumors. Instead, she'd found John, awkward, gentle, and desperate for connection, just as she had been. The afternoon lights softened as Mary rose to prepare supper. Through the kitchen window, she could see old Pete Johnson riding up the lane for his weekly visit. The elderly rancher had become like family, telling Thomas wild stories about Montana's early days while slipping the boy peppermint candies when he thought no one was looking. Mr. Costa from town had sent fresh flour again, insisting Mary's bread was worth the special delivery. Even Samuel Morrison wrote occasionally from his law practice, keeping them informed of Thomas Miller's imprisonment for his numerous frauds across 3 states. As twilight painted the mountains purple, Mary called her men to supper. John lifted Thomas onto his shoulders, their laughter echoing across the yard as they raced toward the house. The table she'd set, once so empty and quiet, now held the warmth and voices she'd yearned for all her life. Later, with Thomas tucked into bed and the ranch settling into evening quiet, Mary and John stood on the porch, his arm protective around her shoulders as they watched stars appear over their land. "Did you ever imagine this?" she whispered, leaning into his solid warmth. John Brown shook his head, wonder in his eyes. "Not once. I just wanted someone who wouldn't fear me." Mary squeezed his hand, both knowing that the hardest journeys had led them home. Together, they had transformed whispered mockery into respected legacy, turned fear into hope, and woven their once separate loneliness into a partnership that would echo through generations.